DreAllDay.com.
You are now tuned in to the show where you learn the discipline to show up day after day to do the work, the confidence to put yourself out there boldly and authentically, and the mental toughness to continue showing up, doing the work, putting yourself out there, even when the success you've expected to achieve has yet to be achieved. And on top of all this, you get a huge dose of personal initiative, which is the go-getter energy that moves any one of us, including yourself, to go and make things happen instead of wait for things to happen. And we put all this together into one bundle, one package, one mindset, one method, one philosophy, one book, one show, one masterclass that is called Work on Your Game. My name is Dre Baldwin, also known as Dre All Day, and welcome to the show. And today we are going into part 2 of, I believe this is going to be 4-part series, where we are dissecting this very argument and concept of anti-racism. Now, I want to tell you before we get into this, before I forget, that I have a text line in which I want you to text me and tell me the most valuable insight that you got from today's episode, or the most important thing that you heard in today's show. The number is 305-384-6894. Again, that's 305-384-6894. Tell me the most valuable thing that you got from what you hear today. Now, let's get on into it. I already gave you a full introduction on this very concept in yesterday's episode, so let's get right to it. Part 2, and I'm starting on point number 5. We did the first 4 points yesterday, so right here on number 5. Mr. Ibram Kendi says, the goal of anti-racism is, quote, racial equity, close quote, based on results. Now let me pause right there before I even get to the rest of what he said here. The goal of anti-racism is racial equity based on results. In other words, until the races are getting equal outcomes, the fight for anti-racism must continue. Now, first I'm going to tell you why this is a genius move, and then I'm going to tell you why it's complete garbage. The reason why it's a genius move is because equity is impossible. Equality is impossible. It is impossible to manufacture equality. And this is exactly what Mr. Kendi is arguing, is that until equality is achieved, we have not achieved peak anti-racism. But I just told you in episode 1622 why equality is impossible. That's the actual topic. That's the actual name of the episode. Equality is impossible. In episode 1619, racial inequality is a fight that you cannot win. And I made full arguments for why these things will never happen. Back in episode 730, way before the social justice movement, I told you that equality is a myth. Now, he went and wrote a book that its very core argument is the goal is to create racial equality. Now, why am I telling you this is genius? This is genius because it will never happen. I.e., this guy will be fighting for anti-racism forever based on his measurement, based on the what's the word I'm looking for? Based on the markers. The word is escaping me here, but based on the, I can't even think of the word, but based on the things that he is saying must be hit, these numbers that must be hit in order to achieve anti-racism, they will never be hit. In other words, he will be fighting for this forever. In other words, you all, not me, but you all will be buying his books and hiring him and listening to his stuff and subscribing to whatever he's offering for the rest of his life, because he is fighting for something that is impossible to achieve. So this is the genius by him. This is a genius marketing move for him to say that we must achieve racial equality based on results. You can't even achieve equality based on results from two people living in the same house, let alone are you going to achieve it amongst an entire races of people. And then what Mr. Kendi does after making this point is he throws out many surface level hand-picked statistics that support his point. So he says something like, all right, well, these people at this race are achieving this level in this thing, while people of another race are only achieving this level at this thing. But that data alone, even though it is factually accurate, it doesn't go into any kind of empirical analysis as to why is it happening. He's just making a blanket argument that because a white person achieves at this level, or white people achieve at this level in this thing, and black people achieve at a lower level in the same thing, that it must be because of racism. But he's not going into any empirical analysis of where this data is coming from, or what other reasons there could possibly be for this data being the data. So this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is full of a lot of bad data. What bad data is, and that's my definition, bad data is data that is not necessarily inaccurate. His data, the stats he's throwing out, we're going to assume that they are factually true, but it is data that only supports his conclusions while at the same time ignoring other related data, and questions that would debunk his ideas. He does not go into any question of, well, what about this? Or what if this data would actually disprove what I'm saying? He doesn't go into any of that. He only throws out the data that supports the claims that he is making. For example, he throws out the data that says black kids are more likely to be disciplined in school. And he throws out some stats in certain places that he says black kids are more likely to be disciplined in school. Now, any of you who went to school where there was a mix of races, maybe you noticed that this happened. Maybe you didn't. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I went to schools where this did happen. I remember I went to Masterman Middle School in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania from 5th through 8th grade. Now, here's the question. Did black kids get disciplined more often than white kids did at that school at the time that I was there? The answer, according to my subjective observation, the answer is yes. Yes, black kids did get disciplined more often than white kids. However, in order for us to figure out why, the question then becomes, all right, that's true. Why did black kids get disciplined more often than white kids? We can't just jump to the conclusion that happened because of racism. And we can say, all right, well, most of the teachers were white. Were they? It was kind of a mix. We can't, just off of that data, we can't say that that's the reason. We got to ask ourselves, why are these black kids getting disciplined more often? Is it just because of racism? We can't just draw that conclusion without going into some type of analysis. Mr. Kendi fails to do this analysis, and he is throwing this out as supporting evidence for racism in schools. But this is bad data. This is bad data. This is it's to say the least, it is false information that he's throwing out here. And he is giving people this data as if they should accept it as true. And this is being printed in a book. And what makes it crazy is when you write a book with a traditional publisher, which this book is written through a traditional publisher, the editors and the fact checkers at those publishing companies are supposed to look at any kind of data that gets thrown out, and they're supposed to ask these critical questions. They're supposed to say, okay, you're throwing this data out, but can you prove it? All right, can you explain why this is happening? You're drawing a line between this factual stat and this conclusion. How are you able to draw that line? Nobody at the publishing company asked this question. And my theory is, I don't know this to be factual, my theory is because the people at that company were so eager to get this book out because they knew how much it was going to sell. Remember that book publishing companies are not fact companies, they are sales companies. Their business is in selling books. It is not in being factually accurate if they don't need to be. If it's going to help sell books, they'll throw the facts out the window. They saw the dollar signs from the money they were going to make from publishing this book, and they just glazed over this. But this is bullshit, this information that he's throwing out here. He concludes that this is because of racism, but what a wise researcher would have done, someone who's more interested in the facts and they're interested in the sensationalism and just backing up their own theory, they would have asked the question, why is this data the data? They would have gone deeper. He didn't do this. His editors didn't do this. That's a failure of this book, and it's a failure of the overall concept. Now, being that I just told you, I went to middle school with it, that was pretty much 50-50 in race. More black kids did get disciplined. You want to know why more black kids got disciplined? Because more black kids were acting up. That's why more black kids got disciplined. More black kids were being bad in class than the white kids. That's why more black kids got in trouble. I was there in the class. I saw it happen. All right, it's half black, half white in that class. If somebody was being bad, it was usually one of the black kids. I saw it. I was there. Now, this doesn't mean it applies to all kids. It doesn't mean all black kids are just badder than white kids. But if I'm presenting the conclusion as the author, it is my job to do the work in finding out why the data is the data. Mr. Kendi completely passed on this for his book, and he draws this conclusion that a racial inequity must mean there's racism existing or that a racist policy exists, and this is bullshit. That is not true. It must be proven empirically. He didn't even do the research to back up his conclusions. He's just throwing these out there, and then people are just accepting it because people don't do their own research. They just accept whatever is put in front of them. And this is why I tell all of you these days, you cannot trust what you hear in media. I don't care if that media is a book, a podcast, even this one right here, a news story, social media. You can't trust the data that people are throwing at you these days because they will throw anything out there to support the beliefs that they have. And if they are heavily invested in those beliefs, like this guy is with his book, and his whole concept, and he's built his whole career around this concept, he can't afford to offer you any information that's going to disprove his findings, because then that would basically delegitimize his entire career. So do you understand why now you really need to start looking at the things that people throw out there and really considering them, taking them with a grain of salt, because if they disprove themselves, well, what do they have left? I'm gonna let you think on that point as we move on to point number 6. Today's topic, once again, is me addressing this very concept of anti-racism. Number 6, this book is based around the argument that some people think certain races are inherently superior or inferior, because that's the definition of racism. Definition of racism is that a person of a certain race believes that their race is better than another race just because of race, not because of anything else. But that's like me saying I believe black people are better than white people just because we're black and they're white. For no other reason. Just because of that, we must be better. Or I hate white people just because they're white. For no other reason, just because they're white. And that's what this book is based around, that argument. But I don't really see or hear that much. Now, while I understand that did exist, back in the days before I was born, I don't see that happening these days. What I see and hear these days, when I hear people talk about race and they're getting real talking about race, I hear people talking about the choices that get made by people of certain races. I hear people talking about the norms of certain pockets of races. I hear people talking about the cultural norms, the things that are accepted in the cultures of certain people of certain races. And this is not just people talking about other races, it's people talking about their own races. I hear black people talking about some of the cultural things that are accepted in the black community as one of the reasons why the black community is not always moving forward the way that it could be. And sometimes they're actually accurate. I hear white people saying it. I've heard Jewish people talk about this of their own communities. So this is what I hear people talking about when they talk about race, and why certain groups of races or certain pockets of races are doing well or they're not doing well, and how they lead to certain outcomes, which is true. These things do lead to outcomes. Now, these are smart, educated, there are smart, educated black people, like Mr. Kendi, the author of this anti-racist book. And they're ignorant, going nowhere, stand on the street corner with nothing going on, black people. Those exist. I know people in both groups. We can't blame policy for that. Policy is not what made Mr. Kendi go to school and get his education and get a degree and become a professor and become an accomplished author. He didn't do that because of policy. He did that because of the choices that he made and the choices that his family made before him that situated him and put him in a position to do that, and the home training he received from his family that put him in a position to think the way that he thinks, was led to the choices that he made, was led to the outcomes that he's achieved in life. Now, there are other people who ain't got nothing going on, same age as him, from the exact same neighborhood as him. They didn't make the same choices, and they ended up in different places. That's not because of policy. Maybe their parents didn't have nothing going on, so they just passed that nothing going on gene to their kids, and their kids ended up in a fucked up position. That ain't because of policy. That's because of the choices that somebody made, and we got to own those choices. This is the very essence of the work on your game philosophy, is that the choices that get made by you or by people around you do lead to the outcomes that you end up with in your life, and those had to be owned by somebody. Even if it wasn't your fault, once you realize that that's what you're in, you realize that's the game you're in, you got to own responsibility. That's how it works. We can't blame policy for people not having the same outcomes. Someone's made choices. You made those choices. Your parents made choices. And as soon as you realize that the situation is the situation, now you got to own it and you got to do something about it. Why? Because that's what leaders do. People who come into power in life own their situation, they take responsibility for their situation, and they do something about it. They get active about it. They take initiative and do something about their situation. If you're blaming policy, unless you have your hands on the button where you can just change policy with a stroke of a pen or a push of a button, which you probably don't and you can't blame policy for your situation. That puts you in a position of somebody else controlling your life, somebody else dictating your outcomes, and that makes you a loser. That makes you a victim, and victims are losers. Just in case anybody didn't know. Point number 7. Today's topic, once again, we are talking the very concept of anti-racism and how I feel about it, and diving into Mr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Number 7, the research and the stats thrown out in this book, I just explained a couple of them earlier today, are hollow statistics. The research is poorly done, if you even want to call this research, what is shared in this book. I'll give you another example. Mr. Kendi states that a 43 there was a 43% reduction in crime for kids who worked summer jobs compared to kids who didn't. In other words, they took a bunch of kids, put some of them in a summer job, and then some of them didn't have a summer job. The ones who did have a job committed 43% less crime when they had the summer job. Now, he states this data to support his point that employment equals less crime. Now, have you heard what I just said? What do you think? Do you think that that's accurate? Do you think that employment equals less crime based on the data that he shared? If that's all you knew, would you say that that's accurate? I'm giving you a second to think about it. I'm going to take a sip of water while I give you a second to think about if you believe that's accurate information. Then I'm going to help you understand how to look critically at data in case you're not thinking the same thing that I'm about to tell you. Okay, so here it is. The answer to the question is maybe. The answer is it depends. We need more information. Because a good researcher, a critical thinker, and I'm not sure if, I don't know Ibram Kendi, so I don't know if he's a critical thinker or not, because he might be a critical thinker who just conveniently left this information out of his book in order to further support his point. He left out the data that might disprove him, so he just left it out on purpose. Or maybe he's not a critical thinker at all, who just wants to support his own data or support his own conclusions by only handpicking the data that will work for him. So I don't know which one he is. I don't know him in order to make that conclusion. But either way, the book fails to do this, and that makes this book a failure on many levels. So the answer is maybe. We need more information because you must ask a further question in order to answer the question. Because we're asking, since 43% less crime was committed by the kids who had a job, here's the question you must ask yourself. The kids who took those summer jobs, did they have less propensity to commit crime either way? Because until we know that, we don't know if the job itself is the reason why fewer crimes got committed. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because look at me. I had summer jobs when I was a kid. And let's just say the times that I had a summer job, I did not have those summer jobs. When I worked in the summer, let me see where I worked. I worked at Pizza Hut in the summer. I worked at McDonald's. I worked at a movie theater. I worked at Rita's Water Ice. I worked at, where else I worked? I worked at CVS. I worked at so many places in the summer times as a kid. But let me tell you something, that is true. If I didn't have those jobs, if I had not gotten hired for those summer jobs, let me tell you what I would not be doing. Crime. Having a job was not the reason that I didn't commit crime. I didn't commit crime because I just wasn't out committing. I wouldn't have been committing crime no matter what. Even if I didn't have a job, I wouldn't have been doing crime. If I didn't have a job, you know what I would have been doing? I would have been at the playground playing basketball, or I would have been talking to some girls or doing something. I wouldn't have been committing crime. So the job did not keep me out of criminal activity. I personally, my character and my home training kept me out of criminal activity. So when he's making an argument that the job reduced crime and then say, well, employment equals less crime, no, that's not necessarily true. You got to do more research. And here's the other thing you got to ask yourself. The people who didn't get the summer jobs, did they not get the summer jobs because they applied and didn't get hired? Or did they not get the summer jobs because they didn't even try because they knew they were going to be doing crime anyway, so they didn't want a job because that would take away time from them doing their criminal activity? These are questions that must be asked if you're going to present research in a book. But he didn't even ask these questions. Now, again, either he did ask the questions and he just left them out of the book because it would disprove his conclusions, or he didn't ask the questions at all because he's a lazy researcher. I don't know which one it is, but it is one or the other. I had editors who fact-checked my points all the time in books that I've written with traditional publishers, and I wasn't even quoting statistics. Now, I'm sure he had research because he's stated a lot of statistical facts in his book, but none of this stuff is questioned. Either they didn't care or they were just focusing way too much more on the money. So should they be labeled racist? They should be labeled racist for not doing the data research to make this guy look better with his conclusions in his book. But nobody's asking these questions again. But maybe if they had questioned him, then maybe he would have went around them and labeled them racist for questioning his conclusions. Who knows? So again, like I said, stroke of genius for the way that he laid this out and drew a line in the sand as to what makes you racist and what doesn't. Let's move on to point number 8. And I want you to really think critically about what I just shared with you there in point number 7. When someone presents you some data, they got to be asking disproving questions. In other words, when someone produces data and says, this statistic proves this conclusion, you got to ask them, well, how do you know that this conclusion is what the data proves? Like, what are some questions that need to be asked around that data? Just because this thing happened doesn't mean it's because of this thing. It might be other things that go way around it. Just because someone had a job and they didn't commit crime, they might not have committed crime anyway, even without a job, like me, and maybe like you too. Moving on to point number 8. We are talking the concept of anti-racism and dissecting Mr. Ibram Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Number 8, he talks about the concept of ebonics. And he talks about how ebonics, the black slang that many of us use, I use it sometimes even here on this show, and sometimes it just comes out of me without even thinking about it. He is saying that ebonics came from Africa. And he talks about how black slaves developed what eventually has morphed into ebonics these days, coming from African slaves. But I am going to dispute this point, and I'm going to present a counter argument that was presented by Mr. Thomas Sowell. He wrote a book called Intellectuals and Race. He wrote another book called Black Rednecks and White Liberals. And this is a book that I suggest anyone who read the anti-racist book, you read Thomas Sowell's book. And you look at what both authors have presented so that you're getting both sides there. These are two distinct sides of the same argument. And see what Mr. Sowell says. And I want you to just pay attention to the way Mr. Thomas Sowell presents his data. Look at the way he presents his arguments. Look at the way he tries to disprove himself in his book. And all of these are what lead me to think that Thomas Sowell may have better information than Ibram Kendi, at least in the book. Again, Ibram Kendi may have all this information. He just left it on the cutting room floor because he needed to present his book in a certain way. Thomas Sowell argues in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals, that ebonics, what we call ebonics now, actually morphed from England, because these people who came from England in the migration of people who came to the United States, it wasn't just black people as slaves, but also whites who came from England, that they mixed with blacks in the South who were slaves and then became emancipated black people, that a lot of that culture and the slang, part of the culture, was adopted by black people. And that is what became ebonics. It actually came from white people from England. Then it got adopted by black people. Then white people kind of left it alone, but black people kept it and they made it theirs. And that's what has now become ebonics. Thomas Sowell argues this in his book, Black Rednecks and White Liberals. You read it for yourself and you draw your own conclusions. Now, your question is, here's the question I'm going to tell you should be asking. Why do I choose to take Thomas Sowell at his word over Ibram Kendi at his word? Is because reading Thomas Sowell's book and looking at the way Thomas Sowell presents his information, it looks like Thomas Sowell does more research, number one. Number two, he looks to disprove himself much more often than Ibram Kendi, and he presents the information that could possibly disprove him in his book, unlike Ibram Kendi. And number three, Thomas Sowell is not trying to draw a hard, sensational conclusion in his book the way that Ibram Kendi is. All three of those combined make me lean towards believing Thomas Sowell over believing Ibram Kendi, because Thomas Sowell doesn't have a dog in the race. He doesn't have a dog in the race that says, okay, this is the conclusion that I'm going to come to and people need to agree with me. Ibram Kendi does have that in his book. Now, that means, here's the paradox of it, everybody. The paradox is Ibram Kendi has sold a lot more books than Thomas Sowell because he is drawing this hard line in the sand conclusion that this is what it is, and it's very sensational and it grabs your attention. Thomas Sowell's not doing that. Thomas Sowell's presenting his book as, here's the information, here's what I know, here's what could possibly disprove this argument, and this argument, and he's just presenting it all for you to draw your own conclusion, whereas Ibram Kendi is drawing a conclusion for you. And that, Ibram Kendi's approach will sell more books and make you more popular. Thomas Sowell's approach gives you more raw, objective information and lets you decide on your own. You got to decide which route you might want to take. And again, you go read both of these books so you can draw your own conclusions and you tell me what you come to based on what you take in. Point number 9. Today's topic, once again, is I'm addressing the concept of anti-racism in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, number 9. In the book, Ibram Kendi says, you cannot group people together and say that because you blank, you are blank. You can't group people together. You can't say because you're black, you are athletic. Because you're white, you're good at school. Because you're Asian, you're going to be a mathematician or an engineer. I agree with this. I agree that you should not and cannot group people together and say that just because of one defining characteristic, that must mean that you're going to do a certain thing or have a certain outcome. I 100% agree with this. But while I do agree with him saying that, and he does say this in his book, he goes on, the same author, he goes on and does this exact thing when he calls teachers racist, as opposed to pointing out something that one teacher did. So he tells a story in his book about how he had a white teacher in his class who one day didn't call on a black student, ignored a black student who raised their hand and called on a white student instead. And that black student seemed to be upset and distraught over the fact that the teacher completely ignored her. And he, Ibram Kendi, kind of spoke up to the teacher and made a fuss over the fact that the teacher had ignored the black student. And then he goes on to draw several conclusions, arguments in his book, where he is calling teachers racist. Teachers, plural, as opposed to just pointing out what that one teacher did. Pointing out what the one teacher did is just his story. That's something that happened. If it happened, it happened. We're going to take him at his word. But then he goes on and he is grouping teachers and calling them racist, when he just said you can't group people together and label them one way. But then he does it himself right after that. Even then, even with all of this, and this goes to the bigger argument on just in racism period, with so many people talking about it, including myself right now here today. Racism is a very tricky thing to prove because racism is a thought. Racism is not an action, it's a thought. Now again, stroke of genius by Ibram Kendi, marketing genius, is that he is taking certain actions and certain outcomes and saying these constitute racism. Whereas the definition of racism is about what's going on in somebody's mind. But he's actually drawing them out and making them tangible things, which gives him, again, plenty of ammunition and again, will have him a job for the rest of his life, because he is making something tangible out of it. This is a marketing, a genius level marketing ploy by Ibram Kendi in doing this. But it is not an honest way to help people. It will help him sell a lot of books, but it's not an honest way to help people. It's not an honest way to inform people. And I've already explained to you many ways already in the yesterday's episode and today's, how he is pulling the wool over many people's eyes, people who don't know how to think critically or never have been told how to think critically, therefore they don't know any better. But I'm gonna help you out with all that. This whole concept attempts to make certain actions racist based on outcomes, as I just said. This is a faulty premise in itself. It's a faulty premise in itself to say that a certain action or a certain outcome equals racism, because there are so many contributing factors to outcomes. There are so many factors that go into certain actions that get taken. But the thing is, if you're looking for something hard enough, you'll find it anywhere. And if you're emotionally engaged in it, and you have people who are already either emotionally engaged along with you or emotionally afraid of being labeled racist, then they'll easily go along with you. So again, all of this is to conclude and say this was a marketing genius by Mr. Kendi, his team, his publishing company, and all of that. But this is, he's misleading a lot of people with this quote unquote information that he has in his book. Deeper research would easily prove this. And again, you go read Thomas Sowell and he'll help you out. And that last name is Sowell, Thomas Sowell. You go read his work and listen to some of his interviews online, and you'll understand how these two gentlemen have completely different approaches to how they are talking about the concept of race, and how one of them is trying to get you to agree with them while the other one is just giving you information, and you can decide however you want to. And I think that matters a lot based on what intention, what is somebody's angle. I told you in episode number, let me tell you what episode that was. In episode number 750, I told you to know your angles and know the angles of other people. In episode 593, see every angle of life, not just the ones that you like. And in life, it is really important that you understand people's angles when they are coming to you with an argument. Ibram Kendi has a very, very strong angle that he needs you to agree with in order for his book to matter. And if you don't agree with that angle, then his book wouldn't matter. He did a great job because he got a lot of people to agree with his angle, because he handpicked the data and the information that he wanted to share and didn't even make a show of trying to disprove himself. Whereas someone like Thomas Sowell does the exact opposite. You decide for yourself. All that being said, let's recap today's class, which is we are in part 2 of 4. We are discussing the concept of anti-racism. Number 5, the goal of anti-racism is racial equality, quote unquote, based on results. And Kendi is throwing out these hand-picked stats to prove his point. This book is full of bad data that he doesn't even try to disprove himself. He just throws out the data that seems to support his conclusion. But a couple of simple critical questions would make it easy to understand that this guy is not doing any type of data, any type of empirical research whatsoever, which makes this book kind of hack-ish. Point number 6, this book is based around the argument that some people think certain races are inherently superior or inferior, but I don't really see people saying that these days. Maybe back in the day, but not really these days. I don't really see that. What I really hear and see are people saying that choices and norms and cultural acceptance are the things that lead to certain outcomes of certain groups. And there are smart, educated black people, and there are also ignorant, going nowhere black people. We can't blame policy for that. Someone has made choices, whether you, your parents, or their parents, and those lead to your outcomes. That is not because of policy, it's because of decisions that people make. And individuals must own those decisions. We cannot blame that on policy. Number 7, the research and stats in this book are hollow and poorly done. I've said this many times already, and we're only halfway through my discussion of this book. He says something like a reduction in crime is linked to people, or he said employment equals a reduction in crime. That is not necessarily true, because the type of people who go get a job are also many times, and we could do research to figure this out, which he should have did because he's the one who wrote the fucking book. We can figure out if the people who are looking to get a job are the same type of people who wouldn't commit crime, and if the people who don't go looking for jobs are the same type of people who would commit crime anyway, whether they had a job or not. He didn't offer that. He didn't look to disprove his own conclusions, which is what we call bad data. When people just throw information out there that supports their point, but they didn't argue, they didn't even push the counter argument, which means they're just trying to get you to conclude a certain conclusion, which again makes you a hack. I'm not saying he's a hack, but this is very hack-ish. Point number 8 talks about ebonics, that they came from Africa. Thomas Sowell argues differently. He said they came from England. The reason I believe Sowell, because of everything I just explained to you right now. Thomas Sowell does a lot more research, and Thomas Sowell does not have a dog in the fight trying to get you to come to a certain conclusion of his, whereas Ibram Kendi wants you to conclude the same thing that he concluded, which causes me to question him. Point number 9 says he says that we cannot group people together and say because of X you are X. I agree with that, but then he goes and calls teachers racist based on one situation of a teacher doing something that he considered to be racist, but we don't know if it was racist. He can't read the teacher's mind. He didn't ask the teacher if she was racist. He was just upset because of what he claimed to have observed in his, who knows, what 3rd grade class, whatever year this was, that he told that story. Even then, racism is very tricky to prove because racism is a thought, it is not an action. The great thing Ibram Kendi did was he turned racism into actions and certain outcomes, but this is a faulty premise in itself, and anyone who does any level of research, just a second level research, could easily prove many of the things that he said here are faulty data, bad data, hollow, and supremely misleading at best. All that being said, I want you to text me, tell me the most valuable insight you got from today's class. My number, 305-384-6894. Once again, 305-384-6894. Work on your game. Dre all day.